Did you just break my window?
It's my street too. I'll do what I want.
You don't get to terrorize people because you're angry.
You people always think you're the victim.
Step back. This is intimidation.
Call the cops. Let's see who they believe.
This didn't have to turn violent.
It always does when someone won't stay in their place.
The shattering truth. Imagine walking out of your home, the place you trust most, and hearing the sound of glass breaking, not by accident, not by nature, but by someone who claims the right to dominate, to intimidate, to destroy what is yours, all because of who you are. This is not a distant story. This is not something that happens somewhere else. This is your neighborhood. This is your street. This is America, and it is happening right now. In the next few minutes, you will witness how a civil dispute between neighbors spiraled into fear, anger, and violence. You will see how words can escalate into actions, how hatred can mask itself in entitlement, and how courage, honesty, and human decency are the only shields against injustice. Stay with us as we dissect every moment. The threats, the shattered windows, the lies, the police response, and the moments where lives were forever changed. You will feel the tension, the fear, and the frustration, but also the lessons of empathy, accountability, and the power of standing together. If you want to understand the true cost of racism and anger and learn how to build a safer, stronger, and more loving community, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel and keep watching. Because the story you're about to see isn't just theirs. It's a warning, a lesson, and a call to action for all of us. The moment everything breaks. The first sound is not a scream, it is glass. A sharp, unforgiving crack that echoes down a quiet street where children once rode bikes and neighbors once waved without fear. It is the sound of something fragile being destroyed, not just a window, but the illusion that this place was safe, that the anger simmering beneath the surface would never boil over. And then the voices come. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. James Walker, 58 years old, stands frozen in the open doorway of the home he has owned for nearly 3 decades. His hand grips the doorframe, not in strength but in disbelief. This is his house, his land, his pride, the place where he believed the world made sense, where rules bent quietly in his favor. What's going on? He asks, his voice rising, cracking, searching for authority that is no longer listening. I didn't do anything. But the moment has already passed him by, because the law does not pause for disbelief, and justice does not care how long you've lived somewhere. This arrest did not begin here in the doorway, with flashing lights and commands shouted over one another. It began earlier, with words, with anger, with a belief, deeply rooted and dangerously wrong, that one man's identity made him more entitled than another. Earlier that day, the neighborhood was ordinary. Cars lined the curb. Lawns were uneven. The air was heavy with summer heat and the kind of silence that only exists before something goes wrong. Across the driveway lived Marcus Reed and his wife Elena, young parents, renters, builders of a future that demanded patience and hope. They paid their rent on time. They kept to themselves. They believed, perhaps naively, that respect was enough to protect them. They were wrong. James had stepped outside not to talk, not to resolve, but to vent, to unload years of bitterness he carried like a weapon. His voice cut through the street, sharp with accusation and poisoned with racial hatred. Words meant to humiliate, words meant to remind Marcus that, in James's mind, this neighborhood was never meant to be shared. Children heard it, neighbors heard it, and Marcus felt it, deeply, painfully, the way only someone who has been reduced to a stereotype can feel. The police were called. They arrived, listened briefly, and assessed what they could. No physical violence, no property damage, no immediate threat that could be legally acted upon. And so they left, doing what the law required, not what the heart wished. This is where many people misunderstand justice. They think justice is instant. They think it always looks like action. They think silence means permission, but sometimes silence is simply the law waiting. 10 minutes later, that silence was shattered. 2 car windows destroyed. Glass scattered across upholstery like ice. A rock left behind, heavy, unmistakable, deliberate. Fear replaced confusion. Anger replaced patience, and something else surfaced too: grief. The quiet grief of realizing that hate had crossed from words into action. When officers returned, they walked into a scene thick with emotion. Voices overlapped, stories conflicted. Everyone wanted to be heard. Everyone felt wronged. James did not deny the broken glass. Instead, he escalated. He spoke of guns that weren't there, of threats that hadn't happened, of conspiracies that collapsed the moment they were examined. He accused, he deflected, he drowned the truth in noise. This was the moment the ground began to shift beneath his feet. Because when someone lies loudly, they don't just obscure reality, they expose themselves. Every claim that falls apart takes credibility with it, and credibility is the currency of freedom when police are deciding who they believe. James stood taller as he spoke, louder as he gestured, more aggressive as he realized the narrative was slipping away from him. He hurled insults, not just at Marcus and Elena, but at the very idea that anyone could challenge him. His words were not crimes, but they were evidence. They revealed rage. They revealed fixation. They revealed intent. And intent is what turns damage into a crime. As officers examined the scene, shards of glass, the rock inside the car, the shaken family standing nearby, the truth began to assemble itself, piece by piece. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but clearly. This was no accident. This was no misunderstanding. This was anger given form. Still, James believed the doorway would save him. Standing inside his home would restore the authority he felt slipping away. "This is my property," he said. "You can't do this." But the law does not see property as a shield for harm, and it does not confuse ownership with immunity. When officers told him he was under arrest, James resisted. Not violently at first, but defiantly. He pulled away. He argued. He demanded explanations as if outrage could undo consequences. This resistance changed everything. What could have ended with handcuffs and silence became a struggle, a physical confirmation of the volatility officers already sensed. Another charge layered onto the first. Another door closed. As James was turned away from the home he believed defined him, the street grew quiet again. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence carried weight. Across the driveway, Marcus held Elena's hand. Their cars were damaged, but their dignity remained intact. They had not screamed. They had not retaliated. They had simply stood in the open, vulnerable, exposed to hatred they did not deserve. And that is the deeper truth of this moment. Racism does not only wound when it shouts, it wounds when it forces others to stand still and endure. This arrest is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a reckoning about credibility, about rage, about how quickly entitlement can collapse into consequence. And most of all, it is a reminder that justice does not always arrive with comfort. But when it comes, it asks us to confront not just what we did, but who we chose to be. A neighborhood on edge racism rarely announces itself as a single explosive moment. More often, it seeps in quietly, settling into the corners of ordinary life, into glances held a second too long, comments disguised as jokes, assumptions passed down like heirlooms. By the time it erupts, it has already done its damage. For Marcus and Elena Reed, the damage began long before the glass shattered. They had moved into the house on Oak Hollow Drive 3 years earlier, drawn by its modest rent, the tree-lined street, and the promise of stability. Marcus worked long shifts at a logistics warehouse on the edge of town. Elena balanced 2 part-time jobs while caring for their children. Their lives were not easy, but they were honest. They believed in routine, in showing up, in keeping their heads down and their hopes intact. They believed that if they respected the neighborhood would respect them back. At first it seemed true. Neighbors nodded in passing. Kids played in adjacent yards. There was no warmth, but there was no hostility either. And sometimes neutrality feels like peace. But James Walker noticed them from the beginning. He noticed their cars. He noticed their visitors. He noticed their laughter on summer evenings. To James, these observations did not register as harmless details. They became grievances. He told himself stories about noise that wasn't excessive, about property lines that felt threatened, about a sense of ownership that extended beyond deeds and fences into something darker and more dangerous. This is how prejudice grows, when discomfort is fed by imagination and validated by silence. On the morning of the incident, Marcus had parked his car along the edge of the driveway, careful not to block access, mindful of space. Elena had taken the kids to stay with family the night before. The house was quieter than usual. James stepped outside shortly after noon. What happened next unfolded quickly, but its roots were deep. James began shouting, not about the car, not about parking, but about who Marcus was. The words were sharp, unmistakable, stripped of pretense. Racial slurs were thrown with confidence, as though repetition over time had made them acceptable. Marcus stood frozen at first. There is a particular kind of paralysis that comes with being targeted like this. A moment where the mind races ahead of the body, calculating risk. Do you respond? Do you stay silent? Do you protect your pride or your safety? Marcus chose restraint. He always had. But restraint does not erase pain. It stores it. It compresses it. And when the police were called, by neighbors who heard the shouting, by those who understood what was happening, even if they could not fully feel it, Marcus felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that someone else would intervene. Dread that nothing would change. When officers arrived the first time, they did what the law allowed. They listened. They assessed. They warned. And then they left. To James, this departure felt like validation. To Marcus, it felt like abandonment. This is one of the cruelest realities of systemic tension. The law can only act on what it can prove in that moment, not on what history has already written on someone's heart. Verbal cruelty, even when soaked in hate, often slips through legal cracks, and so the burden of endurance falls back onto the victim. Marcus stood in his driveway afterward, replaying the words in his head, words he had heard before, in other places, other times, words that reminded him he was always being measured against a standard he did not create. 10 minutes passed, and then came the sound. Glass breaking is unmistakable. It carries a violence that echoes long after the impact. Marcus turned just in time to see shards scatter across his car seat, glittering in the sunlight like something almost beautiful. If not for the fear racing through his chest. Another window shattered. In that instant, something shifted. The situation was no longer about speech or feelings or misunderstandings. It was about safety, about boundaries crossed, about the realization that anger left unchecked will always look for a way to make itself physical. Neighbors emerged from their homes. Phones came out. Voices rose. Confusion spread. And still, Elena wasn't there. Marcus called her immediately. His voice broke as he tried to explain what had happened, as he struggled to sound calm for the sake of the children listening on the other end of the line. Elena felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest. The fear that comes with knowing your family has been targeted, that your absence might have emboldened someone else's cruelty. When officers returned, the neighborhood felt different, heavier, charged. This time the evidence was visible. Broken windows, a rock lying inside the car like a signature, the tangible aftermath of rage. James stood nearby, watching. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look regretful. He looked aggrieved, as if he were the one who had been wronged. This is a painful truth many people struggle to accept. Those who discriminate often see themselves as victims. They reinterpret accountability as persecution. They experience consequences not as justice, but as betrayal. As officers began asking questions, Marcus felt his hands shake. Not from guilt, but from exhaustion. The kind that settles in after years of navigating spaces where you are never quite welcome, where you are expected to absorb insult quietly and move on. He answered calmly, carefully, truthfully. James did not. Instead, James spoke in spirals. He accused Marcus of pulling a gun that no one had seen. He described silencers that did not exist. He hinted at gangs and conspiracies that fell apart the moment officers asked for proof. Each claim widened the gap between reality and James's perception of it. But beneath the absurdity of the accusations was something deeply familiar to Marcus. The need to criminalize Black presence, to paint ordinary life as a threat, to justify hatred by dressing it up as fear. This tactic has a long history in America. It is how neighborhoods were segregated. It is how violence was excused. It is how discrimination learned to wear a badge of concern. As the investigation unfolded, Marcus realized something unsettling. He was being forced to relive the incident over and over, to narrate his own humiliation in a calm voice, to prove, again, that he was not the monster someone else had imagined him to be. This is the hidden cost of racism, not just the slurs or the broken glass, but the constant demand for composure, the expectation that dignity must be maintained even when it is under attack. Elena arrived shortly after, pulling Marcus into a quiet embrace. They stood together, united but exposed, as neighbors watched from a distance. Some looked sympathetic, others looked uncomfortable, a few looked away entirely. Silence can be many things. Sometimes it is protection, sometimes it is fear, and sometimes it is complicity. The officers continued their work, moving methodically, asking questions, documenting damage. They were not there to validate feelings. They were there to establish facts. And facts, slowly but decisively, began to favor the truth Marcus and Elena had lived all along. Still, the emotional weight lingered, because even if justice came, and it would, the hurt would not vanish with handcuffs. The memory of being targeted in your own driveway does not fade easily. The sound of glass breaking becomes a warning bell, echoing long after repairs are made. This neighborhood would never feel the same, but within that loss was something else, quieter but no less powerful. A realization that endurance is not weakness, that restraint is not surrender, that choosing not to respond to hate with violence is an act of courage, even when it feels unfair. Marcus and Elena did not ask to become symbols. They asked only to live, to work, to raise their children without fear. And yet, in standing their ground, by telling the truth, by trusting a system that had often disappointed them, they became something more. They became witnesses. And witnesses, as history has shown us, are often the first step toward change. Truth versus sex, noise. There is a moment in every conflict when truth stops being loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't gesture wildly. It doesn't demand attention. Instead, it waits. That moment arrived quietly on Oak Hollow Drive, after the sirens faded and the adrenaline drained away, when the neighborhood was left with the uncomfortable task of sorting fact from fiction, pain from performance, truth from noise. James Walker was still talking. He talked as officers examined the broken glass. He talked as they photographed the damage. He talked as neighbors stood within earshot, pretending not to listen. His voice carried urgency, but not clarity. Each sentence seemed to contradict the one before it. He described threats that no one else had heard, weapons no one else had seen, dangers that appeared only in his retelling. The more he spoke, the more his story expanded, like a shadow growing longer as the sun sets, untethered from the body that cast it. Marcus stood nearby, hands clasped in front of him, saying very little. This contrast mattered. In moments like these, people often believe truth must be defended aggressively. That silence equals weakness. That restraint looks like guilt. But there is another kind of strength, one rooted in certainty rather than volume. Marcus knew what had happened. He didn't need to embellish it. He didn't need to weaponize fear to make it real. The facts were enough. The officers noticed. They asked James to repeat his account. Then they asked him again. Small details shifted. Timelines blurred. The alleged gun appeared, disappeared, then reappeared with new features. A silencer. A gesture. A movement that no camera captured and no witness confirmed. Noise does this. It multiplies under pressure. Truth, by contrast, stays the same. As body camera footage began to sync with witness statements, the space between James's claims and reality widened. Neighbors, some hesitant, some resolute, confirmed what they had seen and heard: shouting, slurs, the sound of breaking glass. No weapon, no threat from Marcus. Just a man standing in his own driveway, trying not to escalate a situation that was already spiraling. For Marcus, listening to these accounts was both validating and exhausting. Validation came from being believed. Exhaustion came from knowing how rare that belief could be. There is a particular weariness that accompanies telling the truth when you have been conditioned to expect disbelief. It's the fatigue of reliving harm so others can weigh it, measure it, and decide whether it meets some invisible threshold of credibility. Marcus felt it in his shoulders, in the tightness of his jaw, in the way he kept glancing toward Elena, as if to ground himself in something solid. Elena felt it too. She watched James speak with a confidence that bordered on entitlement, as though the very act of accusation entitled him to protection. She recognized the posture, the assumption, the unspoken belief that authority would bend instinctively toward him. This too has a history. In America, lies have often worn the uniform of fear. They have disguised themselves as concern for safety, as neighborhood protection, as common sense. And for generations, those lies have carried consequences far heavier than broken glass. Elena knew this. Marcus knew this. And yet they stood there anyway, because walking away would not undo what had already been done. As the investigation deepened, James grew more agitated. Agitation is what happens when noise begins to realize it is being heard for what it is. His voice rose. His gestures sharpened. He spoke over officers, interrupted questions, and challenged procedures. At one point he laughed, a short, dismissive sound that echoed uncomfortably in the afternoon air. It was the laugh of someone who had never expected accountability. But accountability does not arrive all at once. It arrives in increments, in pauses, in the tightening expressions of officers as inconsistencies stack up, in the subtle shift from listening politely to documenting carefully. Marcus noticed that shift. He felt it as a release he didn't dare name. Because hope, when you've been disappointed too often, feels dangerous. The officers asked James to step aside. They spoke quietly among themselves. One of them approached Marcus again, confirming details, clarifying minor points. Marcus answered steadily. He didn't embellish. He didn't editorialize. He simply told the same story he had told from the beginning. That consistency mattered more than he knew. There is a lesson here, one that extends far beyond this driveway and this afternoon. Truth does not require drama to be compelling. Justice does not need exaggeration to be earned. And dignity, once claimed, does not need permission to exist. As the sun dipped lower, the neighborhood grew quieter. Some residents retreated indoors, uncomfortable with the tension, unwilling to confront what it suggested about their community. Others lingered, drawn by a sense that something important was unfolding, even if they didn't yet understand what it meant. Children peered through windows. Dogs barked. Life, in all its ordinariness, pressed against the edges of a moment that would not soon be forgotten. James's story continued to unravel. Officers pointed out discrepancies. Witnesses contradicted him. Evidence refused to cooperate with his narrative. Each attempt to regain control only revealed more of what he was trying to hide. Not a grand conspiracy, but a simple, corrosive truth. His anger had outpaced his judgment, and his prejudice had convinced him he would never be questioned. That assumption was broken. For Marcus, the pain did not vanish with each exposed lie. If anything, it sharpened, because every false accusation carried an echo of men harmed, imprisoned, or worse, because someone else's fear was accepted as fact. He thought of his children, of the lessons he would one day have to explain, of how he would describe this moment without teaching them despair. He decided then that the story he would tell them would not center on hatred. It would center on endurance, on the choice to remain human when someone else tries to strip that humanity away, on the power of staying grounded in truth when noise demands a reaction. Elena squeezed his hand, sensing the weight of his thoughts. They did not speak. They did not need to. Across the driveway, James was still protesting, still insisting, still trying to bend reality back into a shape that favored him. But reality was no longer listening. This is what happens when truth is allowed to breathe. It does not rush. It does not retaliate. It simply remains, steady, undeniable, and patient enough to outlast the chaos around it. By the time the officers began preparing their next steps, the balance had shifted decisively. What began as an outburst fueled by bias was now a documented pattern of behavior. What was once framed as fear was revealing itself as hostility, and what had been noise was fading, exposed by the quiet persistence of facts. For Marcus and Elena, this was not a victory. It was recognition. Recognition that their pain was real, that their restraint mattered, that their truth had weight, even in a system that had too often failed people who looked like them. And as the day edged toward evening, one thing became clear to everyone watching. When lies collapse under their own excess, they do not simply disappear. They leave behind a reckoning. That reckoning was coming. Rage on display. Rage does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as certainty, the dangerous kind. The kind that convinces a person they are right not because they have examined their beliefs, but because they have repeated them for so long that doubt feels like betrayal. By the time James Walker realized his story was unraveling, his anger had already crossed that threshold. And once rage reaches that point, it stops hiding. It stepped forward as the officers continued their quiet, methodical work. It crept into James's posture, into the tightening of his jaw, into the way his hands clenched and unclenched as though searching for something solid to strike. His voice, once animated with confidence, now carried a sharper edge, less persuasive, more defiant. Rage, when exposed, often masquerades as righteousness. James insisted he was being misunderstood. He claimed bias, ironically, bitterly. He spoke of his rights, his property, his safety. Each word was wrapped in the language of grievance, even as the evidence painted a very different picture. Marcus watched from a short distance away. He had seen this transformation before, not just in individuals, but in moments across history when accountability threatens entitlement. It is the moment when control slips, and those accustomed to dominance feel suddenly cornered. In that moment, anger becomes louder, more reckless, more revealing. This was not about a parked car. It was not about noise or property lines. It was about the refusal to accept a world where Marcus Reed existed without permission. The officers asked James to lower his voice. He did not. They asked him to calm down. He could not. Because rage feeds on escalation. It mistakes volume for power, confrontation for authority. And as James's composure eroded, the mask slipped further, revealing something raw and unfiltered beneath. He pointed toward Marcus, his finger trembling with accusation. He repeated slurs that had already been documented. He framed his hostility as provocation, his violence as reaction. This inversion, the rewriting of cause and effect, is one of racism's oldest tools. It allows harm to disguise itself as self-defense. It allows cruelty to present itself as caution. It allows the aggressor to feel justified, even noble. Elena felt her chest tighten as she listened. Each word struck like a reminder that no amount of respectability could insulate them completely. That safety in moments like this was conditional, fragile, dependent on how well others chose to see them as human. She moved closer to Marcus, their shoulders touching. They did not speak, but the gesture said everything. We are here. We are together. We will not be erased. James, meanwhile, seemed to unravel further with each failed attempt to regain control of the narrative. He interrupted officers mid-sentence. He scoffed at questions. He laughed again, louder this time, a sound tinged with desperation. Rage often laughs when it feels exposed. It laughs because silence would require reflection, and reflection for someone unwilling to confront their own prejudice feels like annihilation. The officer's demeanor shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. Their questions became firmer. Their instructions are more direct. They were no longer merely gathering information. They were managing a threat. That realization landed heavily on the scene. Neighbors who had lingered began to step back. Parents called children inside. Doors closed softly but deliberately. The neighborhood, once a backdrop to everyday life, now bore witness to something darker, an eruption that could no longer be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Marcus felt a familiar ache settle deep in his bones. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition. Recognition that moments like this have played out countless times before, often with far worse endings. Recognition that history is filled with scenes where rage was allowed to dominate, where restraint was punished, where humanity was denied. He thought of his father, who had taught him to stay calm when confronted, not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. He thought of the lessons passed down quietly, painfully from one generation to the next. Lessons no child should have to learn, yet so many do. James's anger crescendoed when an officer informed him that his statements were being recorded and that false accusations carried serious consequences. That word, consequences, hung in the air. For some, it is a familiar companion. For others, it is an unwelcome stranger. James reacted as though it were an insult. His face flushed. His breathing quickened. He began to pace, muttering under his breath, then louder, until the muttering turned into accusations again. He accused the officers of siding against him. He accused Marcus of manipulating the situation. He accused the neighborhood of turning on him. In doing so, he revealed something essential. Rage does not exist in isolation. It demands allies, validation, reinforcement. When it cannot find them, it turns inward, consuming itself. Elena watched this unfold with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, because beneath the hostility, she saw something else. Not excuse, but explanation. A lifetime of unchallenged assumptions. A sense of ownership over spaces and narratives. A belief that authority would always bend in his favor. That belief was cracking, and cracks, while painful, are where light enters. One officer stepped forward and asked James to stop pacing. His tone was calm, measured, firm, the kind of voice used when de-escalation is no longer optional. James ignored the instruction. That moment, the refusal to comply, marked a turning point. Rage had reached its limit. The officers moved closer, positioning themselves with intention. Their presence was no longer passive, it was preparatory. The shift was unmistakable to anyone watching, even those with no training in law enforcement. Marcus felt his heart pound, not with satisfaction, but with gravity, because he understood what this moment represented. Not triumph, not revenge, but accountability is finally catching up to behavior long left unchecked. James continued to protest, his words tumbling over one another. He spoke of unfairness, of betrayal, of how this shouldn't be happening, but it was happening. And the reason it felt so unbearable to him was precisely because it was unfamiliar. For Marcus and Elena, accountability had always been a constant presence, something anticipated, navigated, respected. For James, it arrived like an ambush. This contrast speaks volumes about inequality, not just in outcomes, but in expectations. As officers instructed James to place his hands behind his back, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. This was not a dramatic arrest. There were no cinematic gestures, no raised voices from the officers, just procedure, just consequence, just the quiet assertion that actions matter. James resisted at first, not violently, but stubbornly, a final attempt to assert control, to delay the inevitable, to deny reality one last time. It didn't work. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that felt louder than it was. Marcus flinched, not because he sympathized with James, but because that sound carried so much history, so much complexity, so much pain tied up in the relationship between law enforcement and Black communities. And yet, in this moment, the weight shifted. For once, restraint had not been punished. For once, truth had not been ignored. For once, rage had not been rewarded. Elena exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. Tears welled in her eyes, not of joy, but of release. The kind that comes after tension has stretched too far for too long. The kind that acknowledges both relief and sorrow, justice and loss. Because no one truly wins when hatred reaches this point. James was led away, still talking, still protesting, still clinging to a version of himself that could not survive scrutiny. His voice faded as he was placed in the patrol car, the door closing with a finality that could not be argued away. Silence followed, a heavy, contemplative silence. Marcus stood still, feeling the aftermath ripple through him, the anger he had suppressed, the fear he had managed, the dignity he had fought to preserve. All of it surfaced at once, demanding acknowledgement. Elena wrapped her arms around him, grounding him in the present. Around them, the neighborhood slowly began to breathe again, but nothing was the same, because rage, once displayed so openly, leaves scars. It forces communities to confront truths they would rather avoid. It challenges the illusion that prejudice is rare or accidental. It isn't. It is learned. It is reinforced. And when left unchallenged, it grows bold. Yet this moment, painful as it was, also carried a lesson. That rage does not have to define the ending. That accountability, though uncomfortable, is necessary. that confronting hatred is not an act of division, but an act of preservation, of values, of dignity, of humanity. Marcus and Elena did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They stood quietly holding each other, aware that this was not the end of the story, only a turning point. The hardest lessons were still ahead, and so was the possibility of something better. The quiet power of witness. When the patrol car pulled away, it did not take the tension with it. Instead, the neighborhood was left with something heavier. Responsibility. The kind that lingers after sirens fade, the kind that asks questions no one wants to answer, the kind that demands a reckoning not only with what happened, but with what allowed it to happen. Marcus and Elena remained in their driveway long after the officers left. The broken glass was still there, scattered across the seed and pavement like fragile evidence of a truth that could no longer be denied. Neighbors hovered at a distance, uncertain now of their place in the story, because this moment had shifted something fundamental. No one could claim ignorance anymore. Witnesses, by definition, see what others might prefer to overlook. And once you have seen, neutrality becomes a choice, one that carries its own moral weight. It began quietly. Mrs. Thompson from 2 houses down approached first. She was in her late 60s, her movements careful, deliberate. She had lived on Oak Hollow Drive for nearly 30 years. She had seen families come and go, seen the neighborhood change in ways both subtle and obvious. "I heard him," she said softly, not looking directly at Marcus at first. "The words he used, I've never heard anything like that here." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with shame. Marcus nodded. He did not say thank you. Gratitude felt complicated in moments like this. Being believed should not require bravery from others, and yet he understood how much courage it took for her to step forward. One by one, others followed. A young man across the street confirmed what he had recorded on his phone. The shouting, the slurs, the sound of glass breaking. A couple who had been walking their dog admitted they had hesitated at first, unsure whether to get involved, but ultimately decided they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen what they saw. Each statement was small on its own. Together they formed something powerful, a chorus of truth. This is how justice often begins, not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with ordinary people choosing honesty over comfort, with witnesses who understand that silence protects the aggressor, not the peace. Elena listened closely as each person spoke. She felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth had been shared. Sorrow that it had taken broken glass and police lights to draw it out. She wondered how many moments like this had passed unnoticed. How many times has prejudice been absorbed quietly to avoid conflict? How often neighbors had looked away, telling themselves it wasn't their place. Witnessing, she realized, is not passive. It is a decision. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm, officers returned to gather formal statements. The process was slow, meticulous. Each witness was asked to recount what they had seen, what they had heard, what they could confirm without speculation. Facts mattered here, but so did courage, because telling the truth is rarely without consequence. Some neighbors worried aloud about retaliation, about tension, about what would happen next. Their fears were understandable. Accountability has a way of unsettling people who have grown accustomed to predictability, even when that predictability is unjust. Marcus understood their hesitation. He had lived his entire life navigating spaces where safety was conditional, where speaking up could invite scrutiny or worse. He did not judge them for their fear, but he hoped, quietly, deeply, that this moment would teach them something essential. That community is not defined by proximity alone. It is defined by responsibility to one another. When the last statement was taken and the officers left again, the night felt unusually still. Elena swept glass from the car, each scrape of the broom echoing in the quiet. Marcus helped, careful not to cut himself, mindful of how easily harm can come when you are already wounded. As they worked, a neighbor they barely knew stood at the edge of the driveway. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted. "I heard things before. Not like today, but things." His voice cracked on the last word. This confession mattered. Not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. Racism thrives in silence. It grows bold when unchecked, confident when unchallenged. Every moment of quiet tolerance becomes a lesson, not to the victim, but to the perpetrator. Elena met the man's eyes. "What matters," she said gently, "is what you do now." Her words carried no accusation, only truth. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing, the ordinary noises of a world that continued as if nothing had changed. His mind replayed the day in fragments. The slurs, the glass, the handcuffs, the faces of neighbors stepping forward one by one. He thought about the word witness, not as a legal role, but as a human one. To witness pain is to be changed by it, to carry it forward, even when it would be easier to forget. Marcus wondered how many of those neighbors would remember this day a year from now. How many would tell the story to their children, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Elena lay beside him, equally awake. "I don't want this to harden us," she whispered into the dark. "I don't want the kids to grow up believing this is all there is." Marcus reached for her hand. "It's not all there is," he said, "but it's part of it, and pretending it isn't, that's how it keeps happening." The witnesses had done something important that day. They had disrupted a pattern. They had refused to let prejudice remain hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. But the work was not over. Witnessing is not a single act. It is a commitment. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet conversations. People checked in on Marcus and Elena. Some apologized awkwardly. Others offered help, rides, meals, support. A few said nothing at all, their silence louder now in contrast to those who had spoken. The difference was noticeable. Those who had witnessed openly seemed changed, more thoughtful, more aware, more cautious with their assumptions. Those who had remained silent seemed smaller somehow, burdened by the knowledge of what they had chosen not to do. Marcus and Elena felt the weight of being seen. Visibility can be both validating and exhausting. They were no longer just neighbors. They were symbols of restraint, of dignity, of something many people wanted to believe they would be in a similar situation. But symbolism is heavy, and they were still just people, still parents, still workers, still human. The lesson of the witnesses was not that Marcus and Elena were extraordinary. It was that ordinary people, when they choose courage, can alter the course of events. That speaking the truth does not require perfection, only honesty. That solidarity does not demand grand gestures, only presence. That love for community is proven not in comfort, but in moments of discomfort. The neighborhood would never return to what it was before, but perhaps that was not a loss. Perhaps it was an opportunity to rebuild, not just trust, but awareness. Not just peace, but justice. Not just coexistence, but care. Because when witnesses step forward, they do more than support the victim. They redefine what is acceptable. They redraw the boundaries of belonging. They remind everyone watching that humanity is not a passive trait, it is a practice. And on Oak Hollow Drive, that practice had finally begun. The arrest, aftermath, and consequence. An arrest ends a moment, but it begins a reckoning. In the days after James Walker was taken away from Oak Hollow Drive, the neighborhood learned what many communities discovered too late. Accountability does not arrive with closure. It arrives with questions, with tension, with the slow, uncomfortable work of living honestly with what has been exposed. Marcus felt it immediately. At the warehouse, co-workers spoke more carefully around him, as if his pain were fragile glass that might cut them if mishandled. Some offered quiet support. Others avoided the subject entirely, unsure of what to say, or afraid of saying the wrong thing. Avoidance, Marcus knew, was its own kind of confession. Elena felt it too, in the way parents at school looked at her with sympathy that bordered on pity, in the sudden attentiveness of administrators who had never before asked how she was doing. She appreciated the concern, but it came with a weight she hadn't asked for. Being harmed, she realized, often comes with an expectation. Now teach us something. But healing does not follow a curriculum. The legal process moved slowly, deliberately. Reports were filed, statements reviewed, charges discussed. The language of justice, clinical, procedural, precise, felt distant from the lived reality Marcus and Elena carried with them each day. Broken glass was replaced, the car was repaired, the visible damage faded, the invisible did not. Marcus replayed the arrest in his mind, not with satisfaction, but with a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief that the truth had been acknowledged. Unease because he understood how rare that outcome could be, how easily it could have gone another way. He knew men who had not been believed. He knew families whose stories never made it past the first report. He knew how thin the line was between recognition and erasure. At night, sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of shouting without sound, of standing in his driveway while the world blurred around him. He woke with his jaw clenched, his body tense, as if bracing for an impact that had already passed. Elena noticed. Trauma, she understood, does not announce itself. It settles in quietly, disguised as vigilance, as caution, as the constant scanning of familiar spaces for signs of danger. She tried to restore routine, dinner at the same time, homework at the table, laughter when they could manage it, small rituals that reminded them and their children that life was still theirs. But questions lingered. What if he comes back? What if this makes things worse? What if speaking up costs us more than staying quiet ever did? These questions are the inheritance of those who challenge injustice. They do not come from weakness. They come from experience. When the court date was set, Marcus felt a tightening in his chest he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't afraid of testifying. He was afraid of hoping. Hope in systems that have disappointed you feels like a gamble. The day of the hearing arrived gray and cold. The courthouse loomed larger than it needed to, its stone exterior imposing in a way that felt symbolic rather than accidental. Inside, everything echoed. Footsteps, voices, the shuffle of papers. James sat at the defense table, quieter now, his anger contained but not extinguished. He did not look at Marcus or Elena. Whether from shame or defiance, it was impossible to tell. Marcus noticed how small the room felt, how every detail mattered, how every word carried weight, how the truth, once again, would need to be spoken calmly, carefully, without room for misinterpretation. Witnesses testified. Officers presented evidence. The recording played. James's own words filling the courtroom, stripped of context, stripped of justification, exposed to the light. Hearing them again hurt more than Marcus expected. Pain does not lessen with repetition. Sometimes it sharpens. But something else happened too. The room listened, not distracted, not dismissive, listening. That alone felt extraordinary. Elena watched Marcus as he spoke, steady, composed, refusing to dramatize his pain even as it pressed against him. She felt pride swell in her chest, not because he was strong, but because he was honest. Honesty, she had learned, is its own form of courage. The judge spoke plainly. There were no speeches, no moralizing monologues, just acknowledgement of facts, of behavior, of consequence. James was held accountable, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, but as a person responsible for his actions. That distinction mattered. Justice, when done right, is not about spectacle. It is about recognition of harm, of truth, of responsibility. As Marcus and Elena left the courthouse, the cold air hit their faces sharply. Elena breathed deeply, as if testing whether relief felt the way she had imagined it would. It didn't. Relief was quieter than she expected, more complicated, tied up with sadness, not just for what had happened to them, but for what had been revealed about their community, about the country they loved. Marcus squeezed her hand. "This isn't the end," he said softly. She nodded. They both knew it. Accountability does not undo trauma. It does not heal every wound. It does not guarantee safety tomorrow simply because justice showed up today. But it does something essential. It draws a line that says this behavior is not acceptable, a line that says truth matters, a line that says silence will no longer be the default. Back on Oak Hollow Drive, life resumed in fits and starts. Some neighbors reached out more openly now. Others kept their distance. The absence of James's presence was noticeable. Not just physically, but emotionally. Spaces remember what happened in them. Marcus felt it every time he pulled into the driveway. Elena felt it every time she glanced at the repaired car window. Their children sensed it too, asking questions in the way only children can. Direct, unfiltered, aching for reassurance. "Are we safe now?" one of them asked. Marcus paused before answering. "We're safer," he said finally, "and we're together." That answer was honest, and honesty, again, felt like the most loving thing he could offer. The arrest had sent a message, but not the kind delivered in headlines or viral clips. It sent a quieter message, one that traveled through conversations, through glances, through the way people spoke about the incident when they thought no one else was listening. It said, what happened here mattered, and that message carried responsibility, not just for the courts, but for everyone who heard it. Because justice is not self-sustaining. It requires memory. It requires vigilance. It requires people willing to stand up, not only when harm explodes, but when it begins to whisper. Marcus and Elena understood this now with painful clarity. They had paid the price of visibility. They had carried the weight of being believed in a system that does not always believe people like them. And while the outcome affirmed their truth, it did not absolve the larger reality. Racism does not end with one arrest. Discrimination does not dissolve with one ruling. Love of country is not proven by denial, but by the willingness to confront its flaws. As winter edged closer, Oak Hollow Drive settled into a new normal, one shaped by what had been revealed and what could no longer be ignored. Marcus stood one evening at the edge of his driveway, watching his children play, their laughter cutting through the quiet like a promise. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, but alongside it, something steadier. Resolve. Resolve to tell this story truthfully. Resolve to raise his children without teaching them to hate. Resolve to believe that a stronger America is not built by pretending pain does not exist, but by facing it together. The arrest had been necessary, but the lesson it carried was far larger than any courtroom could hold, and that lesson was only beginning to unfold. A call to humanity, healing, unity, and a stronger America. Healing does not arrive all at once. It comes in pieces, quiet, uneven, sometimes barely noticeable. It comes in the way a neighborhood exhales after holding its breath for too long. It comes in the ordinary moments that slowly begin to feel ordinary again. On Oak Hollow Drive, spring returned. Grass pushed through soil that had been walked over by police boots and shaken by raised voices. Trees bloomed without asking who deserved beauty. Children rode their bikes in lazy circles, laughing without knowing how close that laughter once came to being replaced by fear. Life insisted on continuing. Marcus watched it with a tenderness that surprised him. Before everything happened, he had moved through the world with a guarded hope, optimistic but cautious. He believed in progress, but never assumed it was guaranteed. After the arrest, after the courtrooms and conversations and long nights, that hope changed. It deepened. It was no longer naive. It was deliberate. Elena felt it too. She noticed how her shoulders no longer tensed every time a car slowed near the house, how her breathing had softened, how the children slept more soundly, their questions giving way to play again. Pain had not vanished, but it no longer dominated the room. Healing, she realized, is not forgetting. Healing is remembering without being consumed. Neighbors began to talk again, not about the incident, but about life, about gardens, about work, about the weather. Small talk, once dismissed as trivial, now felt like a quiet victory, because small talk requires safety. One afternoon, a family from down the street knocked on Marcus and Elena's door. They stood awkwardly, shifting their weight, holding a plate of food wrapped carefully in foil. "We just wanted to check in," the woman said, "and to say we're glad you're here." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a speech, but it was real. Marcus thanked them, genuinely. When he closed the door, he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the meaning of the gesture settle. Change rarely announces itself. It whispers. The community had been forced to see something it could no longer unsee. And while not everyone responded the same way, enough people had responded with empathy to make a difference. That mattered. Marcus began speaking more openly, Not as an activist, not as a symbol, but as a neighbor. He shared his experience when asked, without embellishment or bitterness. He spoke about fear and dignity, about responsibility and restraint. He didn't accuse. He invited reflection. What happened to us, he told one small gathering, wasn't just about hate, it was about permission. And permission can be revoked. Those words stayed with people, because revoking permission does not require perfection. It requires intention. Elena volunteered at the school more often now. She listened to parents, to teachers, to students, especially when conversations turned uncomfortable. She learned that many people wanted to do better, but didn't know how to begin. So she showed them. She talked about language, about listening, about asking questions instead of making assumptions. She didn't lecture, she modeled. And slowly something shifted. Not dramatically, not universally, but undeniably. The children noticed it too. They noticed how adults spoke more carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness. They noticed how classmates asked questions instead of repeating insults they didn't understand. They noticed how difference became less of a dividing line and more of a conversation. Marcus watched his son one evening, explaining to a friend why words mattered, how they could hurt even when they weren't meant to. He felt something swell in his chest. Pride, not just in his child, but in the possibility of a future shaped by lessons learned the hard way. America is often described as an idea, but ideas are fragile. They require care. They require challenge. They require people willing to hold them to account. The story of Oak Hollow Drive was never just about one racist neighbor. It was about what happens when a community is confronted with a choice. Ignore, excuse, or engage. Engagement is harder. It asks more of us. It costs comfort, it demands humility, but it also gives more in return. It gives understanding, it gives a connection. It gives hope grounded in action, not illusion. Marcus understood now that loving America did not mean denying its wounds. It meant tending to them, cleaning them, letting them heal properly instead of covering them up and hoping no one noticed the infection underneath. Patriotism, he believed, was not about shouting the loudest. It was about showing up consistently, standing against discrimination, even when it's subtle, standing for dignity, even when it's inconvenient, standing with one another, even when fear suggests retreat. The pain they had endured did not disappear, but it transformed. It became purpose, not the kind that seeks applause, but the kind that seeks progress. Elena thought often about the moment when the window shattered, that sharp, violent sound that marked the crossing of a line. She no longer heard it as the beginning of something terrible. She heard it as a wake-up call, a call that said, "We can do better," and they had. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. On a warm evening, months later, the neighborhood gathered for a simple block barbecue. No speeches, no formalities, just people sharing food, stories, and laughter. Marcus stood with a plate in his hand, watching neighbors talk. Some who had once stayed silent, now speaking openly, asking questions, listening. Elena caught his eye and smiled. In that moment, he felt something powerful. Not triumph, not vindication, but belonging. This is what a stronger America looks like, he thought. Not an America without conflict, but an America willing to face it. Not an America without pain, but an America committed to healing it. Not an America divided by fear, but united by responsibility. The lesson of this story is not about one arrest or one courtroom decision. It is about choice. The choice to reject discrimination in all its forms. The choice to love louder than hate. The choice to help one another, not because it is easy, but because it is right. Every generation inherits the country it is willing to confront. And the future is shaped not by those who deny injustice, but by those who refuse to accept it as inevitable. Marcus and Elena did not ask to become part of this story, but by choosing courage over silence, empathy over resentment, and love over fear, they helped write a better ending than the one that once seemed unavoidable. And that ending belongs to all of us, because America is not just a place, it is a promise that grows stronger every time we choose humanity. A stronger America begins with us, What happened on Oak Hollow Drive was never just about one man, one arrest, or one broken window. It was about a truth we all have to face. Racism doesn't begin with violence. It begins with silence, with excuses, with the decision to look away when discomfort feels easier than courage. But this story also shows us something just as real and far more powerful. It shows us that accountability can interrupt hate, that ordinary people, neighbors, witnesses, families, can become the difference between injustice continuing and justice finally being seen. That pain, when acknowledged instead of denied, can be transformed into understanding, empathy, and change. A stronger America is not built by pretending we are perfect. It is built when we choose to listen instead of dismiss, to speak up instead of stay quiet, and to stand together instead of letting fear divide us. We don't have to agree on everything to protect one another's dignity. We don't have to share the same background to share responsibility for the future. And we don't have to be heroes to do the right thing. We just have to be human. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect, don't let that feeling fade when the video ends. Carry it forward. Use it to choose empathy. Use it to help someone else feel seen. Use it to push back against hate wherever it appears. If you believe these stories matter, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel and visit the channel to watch more real, unfiltered stories that expose the truth, confront discrimination, and remind us of our shared humanity. Because change doesn't start in courtrooms or headlines. It starts with people like you. And together we can build a stronger, more just, more loving America.